Well, this panel has the privilege of starting early. That means I hope that we will have some opportunities for discussion that we might not have had otherwise, depending on how we do. We have some very distinguished speakers and panelists with us this afternoon, and the topic is the role of the international community in supporting the unification process. And we've heard bits and pieces of that over the course of the day, and I hope that we can flesh out a little more in detail what kind of role is really desirable and feasible to expect on the Korean Peninsula if the unification process goes forward under either of the two scenarios that have been sort of on the table, the gradual or the instant version. So why don't we get started with our first presenter, Holger Wolf, and please.
I have to confess that I'm not an expert on Korea, so most of my lessons are drawn from Germany and then my understanding of the situation in Korea. What I'd like to do is to talk about very specific issues that relate to the combination or the overlap between unification and economic transition. There are only two cases in the world where this really fully applies. And the question is, to what extent does unification affect the economic transition process, be it positive or be it negative? So I'll start with that, and I'll argue that the core constraint, as has been discussed earlier before, is really internal migration. Internal migration fundamentally changes the way the economic transition process works, both on the political side and on the economic side. I will argue that it accelerates the process of economic transition, but it also pushes the cost-benefit analysis in direction of early unification, because the partner economy can help tremendously in the process. I'll then talk about the international aspects of the actual transition experience in particular East Germany, but with implications for Korea, and conclude with some caveats and also some lessons. Let me start with the choice of transition strategy and how it is influenced by the fact of unification. In the early 1990s, there was a substantial debate, often summarized by proverbs, between two different groups of proponents of how economic transition should take place. One group argued that it's best to take the bitter medicine all at once to get it over with. That is the radical or cold turkey approach, summarized in the first quote. And it is based on the assumption that a gradualist approach encourages second-best effects and lengthens the process until credibility is established, deters actual investment, and thereby, if at all possible, should be avoided. The alternative argument was that the wise man tests the stones before crossing the river. That is to say, one should approach one problem at a time, prioritize, and then work down a list of choices. Now, it turns out that for most countries it isn't a real choice, simply because the reform capacity is limited. Right? There are some things that can be done early on by the stroke of the pen, price liberalization, to some extent monetary unification, which is already a little bit more difficult. But many of the reforms require very detailed on-the-ground work, putting in a municipal administration system, etc., cannot be done overnight. So de facto, gradualism rules the day. But even so, from a macroeconomic perspective, we see quite significant differences across Europe, with Poland, the Czech Republic moving faster, Hungary, Slovenia moving more slowly. My argument is that for the case of Germany, this choice didn't actually exist. Germany, in principle, had two options. Right? There would have been an option for a successor state of East Germany to pursue economic transition by itself, and then at the end, unify as a culmination step. Right? The alternative was to do both at the same time, reunify initially, and then proceed to the transition challenge under the umbrella of a unified Germany. That debate lasted about a week. It became very clear that instant unification was going to be the answer. One, because politically there was very broad support for it, but also two, because economically any option of having a separate state with full migration and the high wage level and excess demand for skilled labor in West Germany would not be viable. Right? So there was a very clear and very early move in favor of early unification. What that meant was that East Germany pursued a remarkably radical transition strategy, even compared to the more radical parts of Central Europe that transformed at the same time. But within a year, East Germany had a new institutional framework in place, had a new money in place, a sound money in place, right? Had no trade barriers, right? Had full current account and capital account convertibility. Right? All these transitional policies took much longer in the other transition economies of Central and Eastern Europe. So it's really a remarkably rapid transition, which to a large extent ended by the mid-1990s. Right? The last big wave of privatization was 94, 95, and that was it. Right? At that point, there was private ownership, there was an institutional structure in place, the legal structure was in place, and it was in place not only de jure, not only on the books, but de facto, because experienced administrators from West Germany helped installing these systems in East Germany. Right? So it worked in addition. A second argument is that in addition to causing a very rapid unification strategy, very rapid transition strategy, unification also tilts the cost-benefit analysis very strongly in favor of early transition. What does early unification or early front-loaded reform do? Well, it resolves uncertainty. Right? It reduces risk premia and therefore encourages investment. It enhances allocative efficiency by removing second-best outcomes. And thereby is viewed as more rapidly contributing to economic growth. These advantages come at some costs. Right? The institutional structure of West Germany that was imposed on East Germany was not meant for a transition economy. Right? It was meant for the West German economy operating smoothly at very high levels. It was not meant for a transition economy undergoing rapid structural change. The other economies of Central and Eastern Europe could do this more gradually, right? And fine-tune the institutional adjustment to the needs of the day. It implies much higher front-loaded costs in terms of unemployment, but also in terms of financing. And on a technical level, of course, it runs into constraints. Now, if you look at the case of Germany, none of these really applied. Germany had a known institutional structure. It was clear that East Germany, in the end, would have the West German structure. And as a result, there was very little point in transitory deviations from that. Right? So fine-tuning on the way. Migration option constrained what could be done on a gradualist strategy anyways. In particular, the migration option meant that the strategy pursued by some other countries of having a transitory low-wage sector to absorb labor until the capital stock could be built up was not viable in Germany. Right? The lowest feasible wage would have still been a multiple of the wages in the other transition economies. So that part of gradualism was also not an advantage. West Germany had tremendous financial support for the East German transition process. Right? I think the notional current account deficit of East Germany are still all-time records. So the financing was done from the outside. That meant that Germany could actually put in the capital stock and other investments much more rapidly than any other transition economy could feasibly do that. And finally, the seconded officials from West Germany to East Germany made it possible to implement these rules on the ground. That is much, I think, underrated in assessment. If we look at the EBRD transition reports, for example, they routinely in the late 1990s distinguished between countries that have put the laws on the books and countries in which these laws can be enforced by going to the courts. Right? And the same holds on other areas. It takes a lot more to have the skilled officials on the ground that can effectively implement these rules than it takes to put them on the books. So the institutional adjustment in Germany was fundamentally completed by the early 1990s, and even the economic transition to private ownership was done by the mid-1990s, much faster than in the other CEC. One criticism one could raise of the German case here is that Germany has been very reluctant to explore intra-national variations in policies. Right? Tax holidays that are specific to some locations, social security tax rate differences, and other things that could be done within the country. The United States, for example, has a very varied fiscal structure across states. That was not done in Germany, partly for historical reasons, partly because initially the enthusiasm was so high that there was not a perceived political need for that. So in the first part of the argument is really that with unification, the transition strategy choice becomes very, very limited. It has to be rapid, but also it's much cheaper to do it very rapid compared to other transition economies. So there coalesces around that particular solution. We now turn to the outcomes. And I focus here specifically on the international part. So it overlaps a little bit with the ambassador's presentation a moment ago, but not too much. East Germany suffered 4 shocks. Right? 2 of these were common to the other transition economies. 2 were unique to East Germany and would also presumably apply to Korea. The 2 common ones was that the Comecon or CMAA collapsed, so there was a lack of externality. External markets collapsed, and that energy prices increased because they had been subsidized by the Soviet Union. The 2 unique shocks were, one, a unit labor cost shock within Germany that reflected particular choices made, and that's a lesson one can learn from, and 2, the real exchange rate appreciation, which will apply and cannot be avoided. Right? So let me talk about the first one. First, unit labor cost shock. Where did it come from? Fundamentally, we're dealing with a situation in which the wage differences are such that migration will happen. Right? Migration can either happen from labor from the east to the west, or from capital from the west to the east. Right? A decision was made in Germany relatively early on to emphasize capital moving east rather than labor moving west. Labor moving west. The argument being that without a skilled labor force, the East German states could not actually privatize, they could not revitalize, and there would remain permanently lower productivity areas needing permanent transfers from the West. That it was therefore easier to subsidize or to incentivize workers to stay in the East until the capital stock could be built up. Right? So that's a political choice. The criticism doesn't so much apply to the choice, but rather to the way that this particular choice was implemented in practice. Right? As we discussed today already, there are a number of ways of incentivizing individuals not to migrate that do not involve wages. Right? Economic theory tells us that what matters is expected lifetime real income differences. Right? So it's a forward-looking concept. It involves not just the current wage, it involves wage growth, it involves differences in real living costs, and particularly it involves income, not wages. Right? So early on in the German process, there have been a number of papers that suggested alternatives. Right? Paying market wages, but then paying a government subsidy on top of that. So to lift income up to a level that would deter migration, but leave unit labor costs at a level that stabilizes and incentivizes employment. Right? One can think of other mechanisms along those ways. These were underutilized in Germany, again, partly because initially there was a great enthusiasm, and I come to that enthusiasm at the end. So the policy pursued to deter migration was an immediate wage increase, a nominal wage increase, that far exceeded the productivity increase and therefore led to a unit labor cost in East Germany that was substantially above the unit labor cost in West Germany, which was at the time the highest in the world. Right, so East Germany became the most expensive place to employ labor globally. And that contributed, obviously, to the decline. And it's a major difference from the other transition economies. Right? None of the other transition economies had this labor cost shock up front. And it could have been arguably at least substantially reduced by using these other tools to deter migration rather than just wages. Second point is the external adjustment. The unification took the form of large transfers from West Germany to East Germany, creating a major increase in aggregate demand in Germany. There's some excess capacity, but a good part of that spilled over internationally. So the adjustment takes the form of a trade balance deterioration. Part of that comes through the income channel, just higher income automatically leading to more imports, but part of them, particularly on the export side, had to come through real appreciation. Right? And here clearly the German case is not a very good role model of how to proceed that. Right? The easiest way of having done this would be to have revalued the Deutschmark within the European monetary system. Right? That didn't happen. Instead, the adjustment took a long time, and it came primarily through prices initially, inflation picking up both after the monetary unification and then as the demand boom came, inflation grew. That in turn led to the Bundesbank to further accelerate the interest rate, increase the interest rate. That led to more pressures in the European monetary system, and eventually a couple of years later led to the European monetary system crisis, which then led to step devaluations of other currencies, but in a very disruptive manner. So if you look at the outcomes, right, the famous quote by John Connolly, who was a U.S. Treasury Department Secretary, the dollar is our currency but your problem, and sometimes also applies to the German case. Germany exported some of the issues and resulting in the end in the EMS crisis. Well, the adjustment did take place. Right? In the end, it cannot be avoided. It came through the inflation rate rather than through the nominal exchange rate, but it happened. The trade balance deteriorated as expected through the income channel and the price channel. The interesting thing to note at the bottom right hand is that exports actually only stalled, they didn't decline. Right? So there was concern at the time about Standort Germany, so Germany as an export location, due to the real appreciation. But in the end, it was a flatlining for a few years, and then exports happily started to grow again afterwards. Where the adjustment came through was primarily an increase in imports. Right? So the adjustment internationally certainly took place, but it didn't take place in the smoothest possible way one could have thought about, partly related to the politics of the EMS system. Now, if we look at the performance, not too surprising, we have 4 very significant adverse shocks. Right? A huge unit labor cost increase, a significant appreciation, a commodity price shock, and a real appreciation, plus the decline of Comecon, which meant the traditional export markets went away. Right? Take all of these together, it's no surprise that the manufacturing sector in East Germany collapsed completely, as the ambassador just mentioned, alongside manufacturing employment and export as well. But the interesting question is, what would you expect that to look like 10 years later? And there are 2 views that are out there. There's a view that dates back to the resource course literature of the 1970s, and then was taken up in the hysteresis literature a decade later. It said once firms exit, that's it. You lose them, you don't get them back. Right? So this sharp shock could have led to permanent deindustrialization of East Germany. It would have been a sad irony. It would have suggested that the wage increase that was meant to keep workers in the East and to keep East Germany a viable manufacturing location would have actually led to such a collapse in manufacturing and permanent damage that it brought about the very outcome that it was meant to avoid. Right? That view has over the last 10 years come under some doubt, partly because we see a renaissance in manufacturing in a number of countries, including the United States, right, which has experienced a significant export and manufacturing renaissance more recently, after also experiencing a sort of a sharp decline in output. So what happens if we look at Germany? Again, the ambassador briefly mentioned it. Here are the data. These are the export shares of manufacturing firms. They're not perfectly comparable because the firm size changes a bit over the years for statistical reasons, but they're roughly comparable. And what we see is exactly what the ambassador said. One, if you look the difference between the new states and the old states do better. Right? And sort of in the internal German debate that sometimes dominates. But secondly, compare East Germany in 2011 with West Germany in 1992, which no one really argued was a basket case on the international side. Right? East German firms today export more than West German firms did in 1992. Right? And as the ambassador also mentioned, if we were to put this in European context, East Germany also looks very good. So it's a very dramatic increase from a low base, but persistent. And it has lasted now for almost 20 years. Right? This is a very persistent, slow and steady increase in export, in manufacturing, and in manufacturing employment. From a low base, but persistent. So I will ask why this has happened. What made it possible in Germany? And I think 3 things really came together. First is long-term memory. Right? The areas, in particular southeastern Germany, has a very long tradition of manufacturing excellence going back into the 19th century, and of high-skilled crafts production going back centuries before that. Right? So the human capital was there, the experience was there, all the structures were there, the vocational training systems were there. Right? So that's number 1. Number 2, initially it hasn't been mentioned so much today, the German government actually has put in an enormous range of supportive policies for exports, for manufacturing. And this was complemented by private sector initiatives, export chambers, chambers of commerce, the vocational training program, all sort of micro-level initiatives targeted exactly at this. Right? Combine this with the German financial system, which is focused on local finance, both the savings banks and the cooperative banks, and you get a very supportive structure. Right? So the fundamentals were there, the supporting policies were there, but we also face the problem of an extremely high unit labor cost. And with that unit labor cost, it would not have happened. So the third element is a change, real change, a paradigm change in the labor markets happening in the 1990s, and then again in 2000. The first one that I alluded to before is that labor in the new states, after 6 years of seeing extremely high unemployment and little progress, shifted and became much more focused on firm-level productivity-oriented wage negotiations. And we can date that roughly to the middle of the 1990s in the new states. Right? The next 15 years of that policy meant that unit labor costs in East Germany reached parity with West Germany by 2000 and have since fallen to 90% of West Germany. At the same time, as discussed now in the context of the European financial crisis, Germany as a whole, of course, has seen its unit labor cost fall dramatically relative to the other EU countries. Right? So what we see is two supposedly impossible internal devaluations at the same time. We see East Germany relative to West Germany at the same time that West Germany devalues internally relative to the rest of the Eurozone. And it is this decrease in the labor costs combined with the fundamentals and combined with the good policies that made this export renaissance possible. So it's a pretty good, I think, overall examples of what has to come together. Right? And it's a number of things that really come together. What can we learn? Here's a quote by the former Prime Minister of Saxony. Partly it's attributed. I couldn't actually verify that he said it, but he's widely reported to have said that the next unification will do everything better, corresponding to criticism that Germany made mistakes early on by saying, well, we had to do these decisions very rapidly, we did not prepare. So that's obviously one big chance for Korea to think, and a conference like this supported, to think ahead. So what can we learn from the German experience? Let me start with a caveat that one should be very cautious in learning from history. But in 1989, Germany also looked for historical lessons. But in 1989, what did we have in East Germany? We had fixed prices, fixed wages, a monetary system in disarray, controlled trade, and people looked back to 1948 and said, well, we had fixed prices, a monetary system in disarray, and controlled trade. Then Ludwig Erhard came in with a price and wage liberalization. The Americans came in with the introduction of the Deutschmark, and we ended up with an economic miracle. And it wasn't quite as linear in reality in any case. But there was a lot of talk in the early 89-90 period about a second economic miracle happening in East Germany. That led to substantial optimism. And this optimism had effects on the ground, right? The more optimistic policymakers and the general public is, the less is the willingness to take sort of very tough economic decisions, because they don't seem to be necessary. And Chancellor Kohl's famous flourishing landscape is the most famous of this, but it's a widely held view. Right. Now, interestingly enough, it was not a view that was held as strongly in the academic community or the expert community. The Bundesbank had a more skeptical view, the Council of Economic Advisors had more caveats, and the academic community also entered more caveats. But this in the end was dominated by the public debate. That's a little caveat on being careful that all the conditions have to be the same in order to draw real strong lessons from history. Now, what one can learn, I think, are two things. I think it's fairly clear that in any unification plus economic transition, options for two-state solutions and gradualist policies will simply be swamped by the realities of migration and other pressures. So early unification and early, therefore, rapid transition seems the more likely outcome. Second, unification also provides the finances and other resources to make this much easier than it would be in any other transition economy. And I think for both of these, Germany is a good case. What are the challenges? One is to facilitate institutional change. Obviously, the more is done before unification, the better. But at the same time, even after 20 years of engagement between East and West Germany, East Germany was a centrally planned economy, and obviously market reforms, if anything, went backward in those 20 years. So that was not really happening. And secondly, the combination of minimizing long-duration effect of the front-loaded adjustment costs. I think here lessons can be drawn from Germany. These costs were too high in Germany. Right? Using more things like wage subsidies, using these other tools to deter migration, using more intranational variation in policies, having a tax holiday in East Germany. There were a whole set of policies on the micro level that could have been used to reduce these costs, not to eliminate them, but to reduce them to some extent. And secondly, maximizing the potential of the long-range hysteresis, that is to say, drawing on the skilled labor that is there, the natural resources that is there, to maximize the long-term perspective. Here, I think Germany actually done a fairly good job. There's a lot of transfer of knowledge, institutional knowledge and other knowledge from West Germany to East Germany, from vocational training to the savings banks, to chambers of commerce, whole set of very detailed micro-level stuff done by various ministries, and cumulatively having a very important but sort of hard to quantify effect on how well the long-term transition of Germany has been done. So in both of these cases, I think there are lessons. From the first one, it's more negative lessons. The second one is more positive lessons that can be drawn from the German experience. Thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Kim Byung-yun.
Thank you for this opportunity. I shall talk about the roles of the global community for the Korea unification. My presentation is divided in 3 parts. The first part is the complexities of unification. The second one is about three principles I lay down for the unification. The third one, I'll talk about the roles of the global community. I would say the case of Korean unification is the most complex case in history regarding the unification. The reason is as follows. The first one is the initial conditions of North Korea is much worse than any conditions took place in the former Soviet republics and East European countries. If you look at the Soviet case, the Soviet Union has survived for 73 years, from 1918 to 1991, and so it lasted for 73 years. And North Korea has been surviving for about 67 years. If we started from 1945, we know that the longer history of socialism, its worst performance took place in transit period. That means the conditions for the unification in the case of Korean case are not that favorable. But also we know that there is a huge gap in income between South Korea and North Korea. In terms of per capita GDP, North Korean income per capita is only about $1,400, while South Korea's one is more than 30,000 US dollars. But if we calculate income per capita in terms of market exchange rates, North Korea's one is merely $471. South Korean one is $22,007. And so South Korea's income per capita is about 50 times as high as in North Korea's one. But population gap is much smaller compared with Eastern German case. South and North Korea's population ratio is about just 2 to 1. But in German case is 4 to 1. Therefore, we have a lot of difficulties, perhaps in fiscal side, by the task we subsidize from South Korea to North Korea. Also, this economic problem may spill over to political and social area as well. And so unless we control very well an economic domain, then it may spread to political and social areas, which will damage the whole process of unification. The second one, why I argue that unification in Korea case is very complex, is uncertainties. We don't know how this unification will unfold. Does it involve any kind of violence? Will it happen gradually or radically? Or it happens after the collapse of the regime in North Korea, or the regime itself initiates a kind of Chinese-style gradual transformation. We don't know what happened. Therefore, our task is very complex and very multifold. In addition, we have here multiple tasks. As Professor Wolf argued, Germany was the country which experienced the simultaneous tasks of transition and unification. That is only one case. But North Korea case involves perhaps is development from poor country to advanced country. And so tasks are not 2, 3. The first, unification and transition, but also development. In addition, we may have the need of state building. If South Koreans, North Koreans do not get together in living together, then we need some kind of social policy to facilitate social cohesion. So the task is very complex and very difficult. And so I will lay down 3 principles for the perhaps successful unification process. The first one is peace and order. I would say peace and order are the most important determinant of successful unification. If we have luckily choice between violent unification or peaceful coexistence for the time being, I would say we have taken the second one. Because the sufferings of society will be long-lasting if this peace and order are broken down. Also, economic costs will increase drastically with military conflicts. I calculated cost of military conflicts in former such countries in Eastern Europe. When we measure the scale of conflicts from zero, zero means no existence of war, military conflicts, and perfect peace order. The three is full-scale military conflict. Then, after 10 years of this conflict, GDP declines by 15%, as the extent of conflict increases by 1 unit from 0 to 3. That means if a country experiences full-scale war, even after 10 years of that event, the country suffer the loss of 50% of GDP. And so this kind of impact in economic domain is very high. Therefore, we need to avoid any kind of military conflict or violence. The second one is unification process should be led by South Korea, but in cooperation with other countries, including the United States and China. South Korea has the legitimacy, willingness, and resources to lead unification process. Of course, there is a kind of slight decrease in the support for rapid unification among South Koreans nowadays, but still 50% of South Korean support for unification, although it's rapid. If we include the support for gradual unification are following coexistence of the countries, we can say about 70% of South Korean support for unification. I had experimented with South Korean students and the public about how generous they are in giving their money to North Koreans. We had some experiments, and we asked, suppose you have money, say 30,000 US dollar, 30,000 won, and how much would you like to give to South Koreans? How much would you like to give to North Korean refugees? And then most of them gave more money to North Koreans because they believe North Koreans are poorer and needy. Therefore, they are willing to pay more money to North Koreans. So this means South Koreans have a heart to support for North Korea. Therefore, we have willingness and legitimacy and resources. But we have to cooperate with other neighboring countries and United States. The third one is the provision of basic welfare for North Koreans in North should be top priority. Here I mentioned North Koreans in North. That means, well, we prefer the gradual transformation if it's possible, because in that way we can have more time to build North economy before the full unification. But how it's happened? How is it possible? It's possible because it's possible only if North Korea will stay in North Korea. They do not migrate to South Koreans in a massive way. Then it's possible to apply so-called gradual unification process. So if there is any chance of this kind of gradual unification, we have to exploit that kind of chance. Otherwise, we may have to pay very high cost for the unification. That means we need to subsidize North Koreans when something happens. At each stage, we have to provide massive subsistence to North Koreans in terms of food and medicine, etc. Also, we can say health North Koreans can contribute to growth. So after the unification, we find that North Koreans are not well fed and they suffer from malnutrition. That means we will not gather any kind of benefits from having young workers from North Korea. We may have to pay for their cost of hospital. Okay. That means it's better to subsidize North Koreans before the unification. Given these three principles, I will talk about the roles of the global community. Here I assume the collapse scenario, not because I believe desirable, but because it is more demanding. So if we are prepared for this kind of collapse scenario, we may be better prepared for the gradual scenario. Therefore, I would like to concentrate on this collapse scenario. The first one is emergency governance in North Korea. That is a very important issue. The global community should discuss the issue of who should intervene to create order and peace and prevent chaos in North Korea when something happens. That is a very important question. We don't have any firm answer yet, but we have to discuss this matter with Chinese, with Americans, and perhaps between Americans and Chinese as well. There may be some kind of first movers advantage. And so if South Koreans move in advance in North Korea, then we may have some advantage because we are there. Then China has to think about what they can do given the presence of South Koreans in North Korea. But that may cause some troubles among our neighbor countries. And this matter is very important. Therefore, we hope that this matter should be discussed before any kind of event, hopefully. But still, China is, it seems to me that China is reluctant to discuss this matter. Therefore, one realistic solution is that South Korea should negotiate with China to allow to intervene in North Korea and to let Chinese define conditions under which they feel comfortable. So we take initiative, and China will follow what they can do given our first move. There may be some kind of realistic solution. Emergency measures and humanitarian aid. This area is new to South Koreans. We don't have many experiences to provide emergency measures and humanitarian aid in this kind of big scale. Therefore, we need assistance from the global community, which has a lot of experiences in many countries. The area may include weapon disarmament, food delivery, healthcare, keeping peace and order. All these areas require assistance from the global community. And I would argue sufficient and swift food aid is essential. And NGOs have a lot of experience in these areas. I would say the two key criteria of the successful provision of these emergency measures are food and electricity. If you look at the former social countries, people shop in markets, and when they find shortage has disappeared and more food available in shops, they regard transition as successful. Therefore, whether there is plenty of food in markets at home, North Koreans regard, okay, everything is going well. And they will support for any kind of reform or transformation or unification process. The second one, electric supply. Iraq, for example, Iraq households regard electric supply is very important. And they, therefore, when they see the electricity was supplied for 24 hours, they would say everything is fine. Therefore, in each stage of this kind of collapse scenario, we have to make sure that food and electricity will be supplied in plenty way. Otherwise, South Koreans may be anxious what happened, and they may withdraw the support for unification, or they will not support for South Koreans, creating more problems. Dealing with refugees. This method discussed by a previous presenter is very important. If possible, we have to prevent a mass migration from happening. But we have to prepare for migration by setting up refugee camps in South Korea, in China, and perhaps in Japan as well. Also, we lack experience of how to operate these refugee camps, and so we need assistance from the global community in setting up and operating these refugee camps. knowledge on transition policies can be shared. I would say it's fortunate for Koreans to have this transition at the very latest, because all other countries, such countries, have experienced transition already. Therefore, a lot of accumulated knowledge is available from international organizations. As we can utilize or take advantage of this kind of expert knowledge from international community and from other countries. When former social country Eastern Europe started to transition, there was no blueprint for the transition part. Therefore, they started from scratch. Nothing was ready. Therefore, they spontaneously provided some kind of emergency measures, and also IFIs gave some advices. But after some years, when we look back the experience transition, we found that transition is very complex, and a kind of just a simple approach cannot be applicable to many countries. But now, after about 20 years of this transition, we have accumulated a lot of knowledge on transition policies. What policies are the best? What policies are second best? What kind of policies have to be applied to given situations? And so we have to utilize this kind of knowledge which is accumulated in other countries and international organizations. Having said that, I would emphasize the approach by the global community should be flexible, because transition takes a lot of time. Professor Wolf has argued, okay, even nowadays there are some remaining problems. Therefore, we have to think about at least perhaps 2 decades or 3 decades when we say unification process is ended finally. That means we have to be patient. Not only Koreans, but also global community have to be patient. In particular, the straitjacket approach, such as Washington Consensus, should be avoided to allow more flexibility. So when the IFIs give advices, give assistance, they think what are the conditions in North Korea. Then they have to be more flexible, allowing these local conditions are utilized in the best way in combination with their assistance. If they try to impose their program to North Korea, that may not be aligned with North Korean conditions, creating problems. Therefore, not the Washington Consensus, but more flexible, more initial condition-based approach are recommended. Of course, investment in North Korea is very important. When the IMF agrees to allow North Korea to be a member of the country's membership of the IMF membership, then other organizations may follow, and commercial investment may follow as well. Also, the privatization of Korean firms and opening markets will encourage foreign investment in North Korea. North Korea, at this point, has competitive advantage in textile and clothing industry. Textile industry is operating not only in the border area between China and North Korea, but also Pyongyang. Therefore, North Korea will be starting their businesses in this area very easily. And also, there will be huge demand for building infrastructure. For example, gas pipe from Russia to South Korea. And this provides very good business opportunities for the global community. And I'm sure that the South Korean companies and the government will welcome international investment in North Korea. I talk about collapse scenario so far, and these 6 suggestions can be applicable if we modify somehow to the crisis scenario. But what can you do right now to facilitate unification, to prepare better for unification? The first one I would emphasize is education projects, the importance of education projects. We know that the several international NGOs, such as Hans Seidel, Swedish NGO, Syracuse University, Cambridge Essex Universities, and Johnson Exchange, have involved in these education projects. You know that Pyongyang Science Technology University is opened in Pyongyang, doing good work there. And this kind of projects should be encouraged, not discouraged. Because this is key determinant to successful unification and development in North Korea. So I would like to argue the government, not only government, but also international community have to involve in providing more education projects in North Korea. The second one is helping local businesses. We know the European and South Korean businesses and NGOs involved in helping North Koreans by setting up local businesses and teaching job skills, etc. And these local activities are less controlled by center because these NGOs directly contact local households, local villages in North Korea, therefore less controlled by the center. But it is more effective because they teach skills, they teach how to make profit, etc. Therefore, this kind of local activities should be expanded in a way that to help North Koreans to survive, make a profit, and then when something happens, they may transform themselves to become entrepreneurs. So we need North Korean entrepreneurs, hopefully before unification. Then North Koreans will be very proud of their achievement. We have Jung Ju-young, we have Lee Gun-hee, okay? And so we are proud of developing our country by ourselves. But if we, South Koreans, say, we did everything for you, you haven't done anything, then this kind of mentality may be not that good, very harmful for unification. Therefore, helping local business should be key priority of any involvement of the global community and South Korean society. The last one is IFI, International Financial Organizations, institutions should start doing something. I would say for the last 5 years, IFI activities involving North Korea is very much stagnant. Nothing happened. But I think it's better for them to start doing something. For example, gathering data on North Korea or sending fact-find teams to North Korea. And hopefully, in some years, they start discussing with North Koreans on membership. Of course, the three areas are not exhaustive list of any involvement of the community, but I would emphasize three are not well emphasized in other places, but the basic fundamental of helping North Koreans, not only South Koreans, but also a global community can start doing something regarding the three areas. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Kim. I'm struck by the contrast between these two presentations. In Germany, it seems most of the issues of unification and transition were managed within the German community with relatively little outside involvement. We heard this morning about supportive roles from Russia and the United States, but pretty limited. And yet, I think in Professor Kim's presentation, in both scenarios, he envisages quite a significant role for various different components of the international community in supporting in meeting all of these challenges, and not just unification and transition, but also economic development and some of the other challenges that North Korea has institutionally. Quite an interesting contrast. So let me ask Peter Beck. We have two good commentators. Peter, if you'd like to go first, and go ahead.
Thank you, Brad. First, I'd like to say how delighted I am to be here and to get to see some of my old friends and colleagues from Washington, like Brad and Mark. I'd also like to thank all the hosts for inviting me to participate. I have to note, Professor Salgong, that I had to read his book, his seminal work with Leroy Jones almost 25 years ago when I was starting to study Korea and understand the rise of the Korean Jaebol. And it's an honor to be part of a program that you're organizing, and I also enjoyed the presentations very much, and I think one of the roles of a discussant is to push the writers and presenters to think about some difficult questions that they may have been hadn't thought of or were reluctant to address in their presentations. And so my first set of questions and comments is for Professor Wolf, and that is, if he could flesh out a little more clearly some of the lessons from German unification for Korea. And, you know, Ambassador mentioned, and you talked about this briefly, you know, there were a lot of policies that were very difficult decisions that the German government faced, and whether in hindsight those were decisions that the Korean government should follow or not. You mentioned the front-loaded nature of paying for unification. In hindsight, is that viewed as the way to go, or would it have been less costly and less traumatic if it had been less front-loaded? The one-to-one exchange rate. It's hard to even establish a value for the North Korean won. It's such a weak and currency facing hyperinflation. But certainly that was the easy way, or one relatively easy policy, simple step for the West German government to take to minimize the flow of East Germans to the West. And within a few years, there was very little migration. I think Koreans would find your discussion about the labor cost shock to be quite startling. Professor Kim alluded that there may not be as many benefits at first as Koreans expect, but one of the dreams attached to Korean unification is that you have cheap and abundant labor force speaking the same language, literate, if not well-fed, in the North. But this is perhaps the biggest dilemma that South Korea faces of all. The only way that you can utilize and take advantage of this cheap labor is if you keep wages low in the North. But that in turn will invite massive flows of North Koreans. So it seems like Korean government, a future Korean government, is going to have to face a choice between equalizing wages very quickly in a front-loaded way and keeping North Koreans in North Korea. I think we want to avoid refugee camps if at all possible. Because that implies a very serious dislocation that could take many years. There are still refugee camps, I'm told, in the Hong Kong area that the Vietnamese boat people still have not been fully integrated into the region. And we want to avoid refugee camps. And the easy way to do that is to give incentives for North Koreans to stay. But that will require massive transfers from the South. It's also sobering to note that unemployment remained chronically, stubbornly high for 15 years in East Germany, despite these massive transfers, and it's still high. And we still, after 20 years, have not achieved or even really close to economic parity between East and West Germany, as the export figures show. So basically, the West paid East Germans to stay in the East. But is that a policy that the Korean government will be comfortable with adopting, and should they adopt that policy? Also, I'd like to press you, was there an international dimension to German unification? Did IFIs play any role at all, even an advisory role for German unification, or were you really on your own? Also, did foreign and direct investment, were there other European countries or American companies that were willing to invest in East Germany, that saw East Germany as a a new market to enter, or was this really largely West German investment that was flooding in? Did non-German, non-West German foreign investment play any role in German unification? For Professor Kim, I completely agree that the unification scenarios that you outlined for North and South Korea are inherently complex. And like you, I think you're stating that you expect unification to be sudden. I think a sudden unification through collapse is a much more likely scenario than a gradual integration. I don't think it will happen soon. I'm not one that thinks the North is going to collapse anytime soon, but when change does come, I think it will be very sudden. And I noted that your advice that it's better to subsidize and support North Korea now than to deal with a more expensive unification later. But one of the questions I wanted to ask you about, in your paper, or in your outline, you don't give an estimate of what you think unification will cost. And I was wondering, Mark in his presentation this morning mentioned that it will cost at least $1 trillion. My estimate is that it will be more likely several $1 trillion for unification, because we certainly need to have some sense of what that figure will be if we're going to prepare for it. And I was wondering if you've had some thoughts about that. Because we're looking at, if we assume that unification will cost $1 trillion or more, $30 to $100 billion or more per year from the very beginning for unification, to pay for the cost of stabilizing North Korea and to begin to fully integrate the two economies. I'd also like to press you more about the international community, and I'd like to bring Brad into this discussion, because Brad is one of the people that I've relied upon, given his World Bank experience and work that he's done on North Korea. He really personifies the IFI efforts to try to understand North Korea, and I am hoping, I haven't checked with him, but I'm hoping he's still serving as an advisor to the World Bank, because he is really the institutional memory about facilitating transitions, particularly in Vietnam, and also and applying those lessons to Korea. And I take to heart your advice that there should be more projects. And I would note that it's not only Hans Seidel, but Konrad Adenauer, who's part of this program. There are 4. America, we have 1 foundation here, mine, and the Germans have 4 foundations here. And I think that shows you the level of interest that Germany has in Korea and North Korea in particular, in trying to help prepare for that. My foundation has a long track record of exchanges and training programs for North Koreans. We're currently providing textbooks, including for Pyongyang University of Science and Technology, to try and help that university grow. So I completely agree with you that NGOs, both Korean and international, need to step up their efforts. But how much do you think we should expect IFIs like the World Bank to contribute? I think the last figure that I've found from Brad was about $10 billion. And also I think we should discuss what contribution are other key actors going to play. Japan, Mark and others have written about Japan providing perhaps $10 billion if and when relations are well, I guess it won't be normalized with North Korea, but to as part of the economic assistance, since Japan has not and likely will not normalize relations. But I wonder if the kidnapping issue fails to be resolved after unification. I suspect there's a real possibility. Would the Japanese government still put the brakes on providing economic assistance to North Korea, or would they unconditionally provide assistance? Is that a reasonable figure? What about China? What role does China play in terms of supporting the cost of unification? And you mentioned how difficult it is. China doesn't want to talk about any collapse scenarios with North Korea. My assumption is that China will try to carve out a buffer zone, at least in the short to medium term, to stabilize the border region. That means Xinhuiju will likely fall under Chinese control. Chinese troops could be in the port of Rajin and Chongjin area in a matter of a couple of hours. They just finished paving the road. Even though it's a greater distance from the border, it's possible to see China carving out a zone, not for permanent control, but at least temporarily to minimize the flow of refugees. That would mean China would be could potentially control the second largest city in North Korea, in Chongjin. What about Russia? Russia talks a good game, but they have not played any concrete role. But would a pipeline now become a reality? And would this be a project that we would want to support early on, and who would pay for this? I doubt it's the Russians. What role would the U.S. play in the cost of unification? Would USAID be putting up projects, or would be looking at the Coca-Colas and Bechtels of the world to be investing in North Korea? So I think it's useful to start thinking about what roles, because again, we're looking at a cost of at least $50 billion, at least $50 billion probably in the first year, and we're only talking about $1 or $2 billion of that coming from the international community at this point. So I think it's useful to think about what the cost would be, and then how we fund that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. We'll have our other discuss, and then I'll give you each a chance to comment on the questions. So, Kim Jong-hoo.
Thank you for this chance, Chairman. The Korean Exim Bank, surely KEXIM, has very much delighted to sponsor at this kind of a prestigious conference on particularly Korean reunification issues. And the KEXIM has been entrusted with two major governmental funds. One is the Economic Development Cooperation Fund, assisting the developing countries overseas for their economic development, and the Inter-Korean Cooperation Fund that has been assisting South Korean businesses and NGOs to work with North Korea for the past 20 years. Even though the inter-Korean relations are not in good shape, but the Inter-Korean Cooperation Fund will play an important role in the future to promote Inter-Korean cooperation and conciliation. Let me start with a quiz. Why is a car's windshield so large and a rear view mirror so small? It is because what to come is more important than what has gone. It implies that the future is more important than the past. The Koreans used that kind of a wisdom whenever they talked about the unification. Okay, the future will change everything. So the pink-colored reunification master plan will replace what we have been suffering. So they say, look ahead and move on. But when we drive a car, we just move on. But nowadays we have a more complicated traffic system with the help of the navigation capability available in our life. So instead of a linear vision, a multidimensional vision will be more helpful for Koreans and neighbors to design Korean reunification in the future. If I use that analogy once more, the driving is determined by types of driver, vehicle, and system. So Korean drive for reunification probably depends on the type of decision makers and governments and international system. So this session is focusing on the role of the international community, how to utilize the relationship with international community in pursuing reunification. Well, for the time being, it has been regarded and insisted to be national issue. Hey, wait. The U.S. forces get out, and the other, the foreigners do not touch the Korean issue. Or only Koreans, just between us, will handle that. But it has been much limited, and well, the past sunshine policy, of course, made a good effect, but it didn't make success as expected because it didn't much pay attention to international community's role and the relationship with that. As the Dr. Kim explained how international cooperation would be important. Well, I have no other words to add, but the international cooperation is not that simple. Well, the German lessons all touch the international affairs as well as the domestic affairs. Where French and English positions were not easy for the German people when they were assisted by Americans. Well, for the Koreans, Chinese may not be supportive. Americans may be reluctant. Japanese may have a different desire. So what matters is the skills of coordination among those the concerned parties. Before going further, I saw a video of interviewing Kim Han-sol, the grandson of Kim Jong-il, this is the leader of North Korea, saying that he was dreaming of unification because he felt sad he couldn't go to the other side, that is South Korea. Well, if that young grandson of the previous leader of North Korea has a kind of a desire for reunification, we have a hope, in a way. And South Koreans will try the many measures in order to facilitate cooperation and promote ideas of the conciliation by dialoguing with the North Koreans, not only in North Korea but also overseas. Well, probably the early 1970s might be the best chance for North Koreans to think of the Korean reunification in their terms. In the wake of a senior U.S. rapprochement, and it was plausible for North Koreans because there was a small economic gap between North and South. But after that moment, the economic gap between the two Koreas got widened, and North Korea lost the chance. So as Dr. Kim included in his principles for reunification, the future Korean reunification would be South Korea-led. Well, the North Korea tried some economic changes in early 2000s, but the leadership withdrew most of them within 3 years because of their foreign affairs that created obstacles to international cooperation. So unless they reform themselves radically, fundamentally, they will be much limited in the reaping from applying any kind of economic changes. They must be persuaded the global ways of changing the economy and the political system would be safe, would not harm North Koreans. In that sense, the dialogue between North and South Korea and North Korea and international community must be promoted. Of course, there is an obstacle attributed by the nuclear arms development. Well, recently South Korea has been updating herself with many programs and projects, including KSP, knowledge sharing program, to assist developing countries get more specific, sophisticated ideas of development and governance. Well, we may have to develop the North Korea version KSP sooner or later, and we will promote the programs and ideas to work with North Korea. Well, I have some questions. There will be two kinds of scenarios, simply speaking. One is a sudden reunification, the other is gradual. If I focus on the sudden reunification, there will be different stages of engagement or involvement. At the initial stage, we may have to promote in Korean cooperative relations, and we persuade North Korea to get involved with international affairs positively. Second stage, we will push North Korea to step further to enjoy international cooperation. And at the third and final stage, we help North Korea prepare for the reunification. Each stage would find different types of resources. At the first stage, a Korean Cooperation Fund will be useful, and the international public funds would be helpful for the first and second stage. And when economic environment for investment and the development in North Korea is promoted and the change, the international and domestic private funds would be attracted, would be induced. I would like to ask Dr. Kim and Dr. Wolf on how to jot down immediate tasks to promote international cooperation and find more and various resources to prepare Korean reunification. My discussion is here. Thank you.
Thank you. Just one comment, and then I'll give each of our presenters 2 minutes each to respond. Just an observation is that we're at an interesting period, and we talked this morning about 2013 creating a new, maybe historic opportunity for the two Koreas to realign in their relationship and go down a new path. It's interesting to me that the Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, and the new President of the World Bank, Jim Kim, are both of Korean descent and have a great interest in things Korean. And in both the security and in the economic areas, you have leadership at the global level that cares. And, creative ways to address the challenges on the Korean Peninsula can be supported through the international system with leadership that cares and is interested to find ways to be helpful, but requires the support of the membership of the Security Council on the security issues, particularly the nuclear program, and requires the support of the major shareholders, particularly Germany, along with Japan and other European countries who are critical shareholders in the World Bank and IMF. And my only appeal is that there's a window of opportunity, so it's a good time to get creative. And with that, I'll invite our two speakers to offer their thoughts.
Let me start them briefly. Since I only have 2 minutes, let me just pick a couple of points shortly. One is the exchange rate conversion, the famous 1-to-1, and whether it was too generous or not. This exchange rate applied to both stock values and to flow values. It mattered a lot for wealth distribution. Right? It allowed the East Germans to convert their savings accounts into Deutschmarks at an advantageous rate and then convert it into consumption. It matters, as Minister Carstens mentioned, for pensions, which were also very generous in the East German case. Where it did not matter for is the labor market. The conversion happened in the summer of 1919, and as Marcus Noland mentioned, the wage increases came afterwards. Wage increases that drove up East German unit labor costs came after the monetary unification. One can also think about it differently, right? The objective was to deter migration from the new states to the old states by raising the relative wage level in the new states to a fairly high fraction of the old states, right? Which implies that had a less generous conversion rate been used, say 2 to 1 except of 1 to 1, the after the effect normal wage increase would simply have been twice as high, which still have to get to the 70 or 80% relative wage level. Right, so that is simply an issue where the exchange rate did not matter. It mattered for the stock values, it mattered for pensions, but not for the labor market per se. One lesson that I didn't mention in the presentation, because after listening to the presentation and the very fact of the conference taking place, was to be cautious about the outlook for unification. And it is going to be difficult and a very, very costly effect. But that clearly was not widely perceived that way in Germany. There was much more initial enthusiasm, hopes for an economic miracle that shaped initial policy decisions, and some may have tilted too much to the generous side relative to the costs that were realized afterwards. But I think that is a lesson very well taken in Korea. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this conference. Other lessons, it is important to distinguish between wages and incomes when talking about migration incentives. Right? What matters is relative household incomes, not relative wages. And there are a variety of tools to deal with that, right? From rent control, from handing over housing stock to the residents, to income subsidies of the way that Akolov, Yellen, and others have promoted. Right? So one can work on that particular dimension, keeping the labor cost as perceived by firms realistic, but raising the relative income levels to reduce the migration incentive. That in Germany could have been done more than has been done. On the employment prospect, well, in the end, Germany decided to, as rapidly as possible, transfer East Germany to the same high capital standard as West Germany, to move toward differentiated, high-quality manufacturing. And that had simply an implication on the feasible time path for employment, because it was a very, very capital-intensive process. So it could have been done on the margin. I think things could have been improved. But the first order effects were there. Right? So the lessons are more on mitigating the costs a bit and improving the growth a bit, but the first order effect was simply implied by the mechanics and the economics of it. Lastly, on the international side, let me pick out one specific aspect, which is FDI. Right? There was very little foreign, let us say, non-German investment in East Germany. Why was that? Well, if you look at the typical motives for foreign direct investment, one was low-cost labor. Well, why go to East Germany when you can go to Poland? Right? Wages in East Germany were way higher, and even with subsidies would not have been lower. Secondly, very specialized information, and thirdly, natural resources. Resources weren't there, so it leaves sort of specific market access motives or specific resource motives. As Marcus Noland mentioned today, however, the incentive for West German firms to buy these potentially competing East German firms was way higher than the incentives for non-German firms, because they were directly contesting potentially in the domestic market. So in the end, the price paid, the bidding process, right, favored German bidders overall. So I would say, if I look at the question and say, did Germany deter foreign investment, or was it simply the question that foreign investors did not have as much of an incentive to buy German firms? It's more the latter than the former, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Kim?
Okay, I briefly touch the issue of currency conversion. I think currency conversion itself does not make a big difference in labor markets unless it is combined with minimum wage regulations. But that's what happened in Germany, because one-to-one currency conversion was combined with minimum wage regulation. That made a lot of impact on labor markets. So I think it's important to avoid the mistake made in Germany, such in a way currency was converted to one-to-one basis. Also, is avoid the mistake by applying minimum wage laws in German workers. But let North Koreans have their basic food in return for this kind of one-to-one conversion, and let them work by wage subsidies. So wages should be kept low, but income should be sufficient to allow them to survive, allow not to come to South Korea. And also let the North Koreans start their businesses by having some kind of loan entrepreneurship loan. This kind of new inventions may help transit process. And the cost unification, this is the areas in which Dr. Noland and Professor Funk have expertise. But I would agree, if unification takes place in certain way, it will be several $1 trillion. But the cost unification is proportional to the speed of full unification, which is determined by the extent of mass migration. So unification cost is a function of the number of migrants from north to south. And so the critical question is how to control the number of migrants from north to south is critical determinant of the cost unification. So although the unification takes place in a very certain way, we try to say take advantage of any kind of gap between the initial event, signaling for the collapse of the regime, and actual unification. So we have this kind of window opportunities. Then what we can do is to make North Koreans stay there, that to come, and then try to keep peace and order, provide food, and also make them start kind of basic transition policies. So we have to think about what policies can be separating from the regime collapse and the full unification. If that window is open, we have to take that window. It's a good chance. And international communities, I think if you look at the East European countries, well, we can say IMF, World Bank did great jobs in these countries, yes, but the amount of money they gave to these countries is very limited. If you look at the Polish case, Poland, each resident in Poland has received $491 from 1990 to 2006. For the 16 years, individual Polish has received about $500 from IFIs. So we cannot expect much money coming from international financial organizations to North Korea. But more important one is private savings, private investment. And so when we design policy for transition in North Korea and policy for development, we think about how can we attract commercial or private investment in North Korea. But initial triggering effect comes from this public money coming from IFIs. So unless IMF or World Bank come initially, no commercial money will follow. And so that's why it's very important to have IMF endorsement, membership. Then FDI may come in a massive way if policies are appropriate. And so we have to rely more on commercial investment rather than on assistance from IFIs. But IFIs triggering effect is very important.
Great, thank you very much. Very lively session, and I think we should close the session so we can get into the closing session. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much.
Okay, now it's time to wrap up. We had such a productive and fruitful discussion all day today, and this is a wrap-up panel. With the panelists all had opportunities to share their views and insights this morning and this afternoon. So I don't think you need really the long time, except the things because of time constraints, you wanted to talk, but you didn't have time to talk. So just mention some of the points. I'll give you a maximum of 7 minutes to all of you. We covered 3 issue areas. First, we just discussed the current state of North-South relations and the challenges faced by the two Koreas. And then we talked about cost and benefits of unification. And then third, the role of international community. So on these three subjects, I suppose the latter two are more of our focus. So actually, you can concentrate on the latter part of these three subjects. Okay, so why don't we start with the Mr. Carstens? Yes, please.
Mr. Chairman, ich muss auch meinerseits sagen, dass die Diskussionen heute sehr, sehr interessant gewesen sind. Alles habe ich für interessant gehalten. Manches war auch neu. Aber es hat auch eine ganze Zeit lang bei mir eine Phase gegeben, wo ich gedacht habe, was ist es doch gut gewesen für Deutschland, dass wir uns vorher nicht all die Gedanken machen konnten. Wir mussten entscheiden, machen wir es, ja oder nein. Der Bundeskanzler Helmut Kohl hat gesagt, wir machen es, und es ist durchgezogen worden. Und nun kann man auch durchaus sagen, es ist so und so teuer geworden und es kostet noch jetzt jährlich 4 bis 5% vom Bruttosozialprodukt. Aber man kann auch sagen, wenn bei den Lohnentscheidungen der letzten 10 Jahre jeweils 1% weniger ausgehandelt worden wäre, dann hätten wir trotz deutscher Einheit auch nicht mehr Einkommen in der Tasche gehabt. Man muss das immer in Relation sehen zu dem, wie auch der Bürger das fühlt, was er nicht mehr hat. Und trotzdem haben wir einen hohen Lebensstandard in Deutschland. Die Bevölkerung ist damit ganz gut zufrieden und würde jederzeit mit großer Mehrheit sagen, wenn wir das noch einmal genauso machen müssten, wir täten es. Wir wollten nicht wieder darauf verzichten. Ich will damit nur zum Ausdruck bringen, man muss, wenn solche Dinge anstehen, auch zielstrebig vorgehen und sagen, wenn wir die Chance haben, dann machen wir es. Dann halte ich viel von einer guten Vorbereitung, immer. Und hier sind viele Anregungen gekommen. Davon muss man auch eine Menge beherzigen, auch was den internationalen Rahmen angeht und die Betrachtung der Nachbarn und deren Vorstellungen, die man vermutet. Aber da kann man nicht allzu viel im Voraus planen. Da muss man auch auf die Situation eingehen und klug vorgehen, so wie wir das versucht haben zu Zeiten der CDU geführten Regierungen, aber auch zur Zeit der SPD geführten Regierungen, beginnend mit Willy Brandt. Wir haben zum Beispiel es geschafft, dem Regime der DDR Geld zur Verfügung zu stellen, in schwieriger Lage, und dadurch erreicht, dass die Rentner aus Ostdeutschland den Westen besuchen konnten. Sie sind durch die Lande gefahren, haben sich angeschaut, wie schön der Westen ist, und haben die größte Propaganda gemacht bei ihrer Rückkehr zu ihren Familien, was alles dazu geführt hat, dass im Lande Ostdeutschlands eine immer stärkere Bewegung in Gang kam, sich in Richtung Freiheit begeben zu wollen. Jetzt will ich nicht empfehlen, in Richtung Nordkorea irgendetwas Inspiratives zu machen, weil ich nicht weiß, wie gefährlich das sein könnte. Aber den Freiheitsgedanken in Nordkorea anzusprechen, das ist eine Möglichkeit. Man muss dann aber auch wirklich sagen, dass man die Vereinigung will, dass man sich als Brüder und Schwestern versteht und dass man sehnlichst wünscht, möglichst bald zusammenzukommen und dass die Tür offen steht für gemeinsame Zukunft. Was mir nicht behagt hat, das ist aber wohl unausrottbar bei derartigen Diskussionen, Es stimmt, dass wir 4 bis 5% des Bruttosozialprodukts noch jährlich zahlen für die Folgekosten der deutschen Vereinigung. Aber ich hatte mir vorgenommen, hier heute Morgen darzulegen, dass man bei einer Vereinigung Koreas die Fehler, die wir gemacht haben, nicht machen sollte, um überhaupt nicht erst zu diesen 4-5% zu kommen. Wenn dann aber ständig weiter hochgerechnet wird, weil das Bevölkerungsverhältnis von Nordkorea zu Südkorea noch schlechter ist als das von Westdeutschland zu Ostdeutschland, dann komme ich auf 9 bis 10%. Das ist richtig, aber wenn ich die Fehler gar nicht erst mache, die wir in Deutschland gemacht haben, dann komme ich nicht auf 10%, sondern möglicherweise nur auf 1 oder 2%. Und deswegen möchte ich das noch einmal auch sagen, weil mir so sehr daran liegt, dass wir, wenn es eben geht, in Korea zu einer Vereinigung kommen. Das ist mir ein echtes Herzensanliegen. Seitdem ich das vor 28 Jahren gesehen habe, da an der Grenze, da ist es mir kalt den Rücken runtergelaufen und ich habe nur die ganze Zeit immer wieder mal an Korea gedacht und gehofft, hoffentlich kommt es nun bald zu einer Vereinigung. Dieser Gedanke, der einfach Berücksichtigung finden muss, sonst kann Korea das gar nicht bezahlen. Wenn man die Politik Deutschlands hier wiederholte, würde Südkorea das nicht schaffen. Jedenfalls nicht ohne Unruhen im Lande gleich welcher Art. Ich halte das für relativ leicht praktizierbar, was ich vorgeschlagen habe. Die Bevölkerung in Nordkorea ist so am Boden. Das ist ja unvorstellbar grausam, wie die leben müssen. Und wenn man zusammenkommt und mit der großen Leistungskraft Südkoreas das Land aufbaut, dann kann man sehr schnell Löhne zahlen, die deutlich im Einkommen über dem liegen, was wir zurzeit dort in Nordkorea kennen. Ganz schnell. Und dann wäre das immer noch so günstig, dass die südkoreanischen Firmen und sonstige Firmen in der Welt zumindest in großer Zahl bereit wären, hierher zu gehen, in den Norden, ganz anders als das bei uns in Deutschland der Fall war. Da waren die Kosten einfach zu hoch. Dann geht keiner hin. Da können sie 50% Subventionen für die Ansiedlung hinterherwerfen und kriegen trotzdem kaum Betriebe hin. Also von Grund an und von Beginn an den richtigen Start hinlegen. Mit Löhnen, die relativ niedrig sind. Aber wenn dann innerhalb einiger Jahre eine Art Vollbeschäftigung in Richtung Vollbeschäftigung zustande gekommen ist, dann wird sich am Markt zwischen Angebot und Nachfrage auch bei den Arbeitnehmern, zunächst bei den Facharbeitern, ganz schnell herauskristallisieren, dass man für die niedrigen Löhne keine Fachkräfte mehr bekommt. Dann steigt das an um 5%, um 10%, das dauert ein paar Jahre und wir haben dann ein Niveau, was sich die Nordvietnamesen heute noch gar nicht träumen könnten. Das heißt also, man muss das so wollen, das muss aber ein Konsens sein, hier im Süden zunächst mal, dass man das auch durchsteht. Welche Mittel dazu da sind, hier im Lande kann ich nicht beantworten, weil ich nicht weiß, wie stark die Gewerkschaften sind, welchen Einfluss die haben, wie das üblich ist bei Lohnverhandlungen. Aber da muss möglicherweise auch die Politik einwirken, aber das würde ich nicht empfehlen, nur dann, wenn es sonst keine Möglichkeiten gibt, vielleicht dann, ja. Aber das ist das eine und das Entscheidende, was umgesetzt werden muss. Dann das weitere, Kosten, die entstehen. Dann gehen die Zahlen in Billionen Größenordnung und ich kann nur erschaudern vor all den Zahlen, die ich dann höre. Wofür sollen die Kosten entstehen? Die Verkehrsinfrastruktur muss gebaut werden, selbstverständlich. Da macht man einen Plan, den kann man auch jetzt fertig machen, was nötig ist, um von hier aus dem Süden zum Norden die nötigen Straßen zu bauen, Eisenbahnlinien und so weiter. Eisenbahnlinien wird man wahrscheinlich nicht privatisieren können. Ich vermute mal, dass das Staatsaufgabe bleiben wird. Ich weiß gar nicht, wie hier bei Ihnen die Eisenbahnen organisiert sind. Aber Straßenbau, wenn man da Autobahnen durchlegte und hätte das Geld nicht zur Verfügung, kann ich die doch privatisieren. Die kann ich doch mit Kusshand über Autobahngebühren privatisieren. Das wird doch in vielen Ländern der Erde so gemacht. Wenn ich den Auftrag erteilte, Telekommunikation und diese neuen Technologien auszuschreiben weltweit, da kriegen Sie doch Geld dazu, wenn Sie das Firmen übergeben, die das machen. So kann man doch eine Menge auf den Weg bringen und mit inländischen Firmen und mit ausländischen Firmen so etwas so gestalten, dass das auch alles machbar ist. Da gibt es einen Wohnungsbestand im Norden, der wird ja nicht gut sein. Aber den könnte ich privatisieren. Für wenig Geld. Könnte die Kredite zu 1% Zinsen dazugeben. Aber private Kredite vergeben. Und wenn es die Einzelnen nicht kaufen können, weil sie sowas noch gar nicht kennen und gar nicht vorstellen können, dann macht man das genossenschaftlich. Und dadurch bekomme ich dann nicht nur die niedrigen Wohnungskosten, sondern ich habe auch die Menschen Nordkoreas gebunden an ihr Zuhause. Und wenn Sie sehen, dass es im Süden hohe Mieten gibt, die Löhne dort im Norden doch wahrscheinlich relativ schnell nachkommen, dann bleiben mehr im Norden, als man es hätte ohne diese günstigen Wohnungen. Die Landwirtschaft könnte man entsprechend binden an die Flächen, dass man sie günstig übergibt und die landwirtschaftlichen Flächen bearbeiten, bleiben da. So kann man also eine Menge von Einzelheiten auf den Weg bringen, die Immigrationsprobleme mildern helfen und Kosten erst gar nicht im weiten Umfang entstehen lassen. Und mit diesem Optimismus sollte man rangehen. Ich traue das den Koreanern schon zu und die brauchen gar nicht auf andere zu setzen. Von den anderen kriegen sie ein paar Groschen, das heißt ein paar Millionen, aber das sind ein paar Groschen in dem Zusammenhang, den Rest machen sie alleine und da sind sie auch stark genug dazu.
Okay, thank you very much. I wish we just had more time. Now, Mark Nolan, please.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank Dr. Sagang and IGE and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, KDI, and the Exim Bank for their support of this conference. We've discussed potential Korean unification in terms of two broad scenarios. One a gradual unification, one an abrupt unification, and we focused on the German case. But I think if we step back, the Korean case is potentially more complex, and I think potentially much more dangerous. I think that the primary driver in how this plays out will be political stability in the North. Suppose Kim Jong-un is able to successfully manage the situation he is in now. If that is the case, then gradual consensual unification may actually be the least likely scenario. If the North Korean state is able to stabilize itself, then you have an elite that has a stake in the continued maintenance of that state. And rather than unification, we may be at a moment analogous to some time in the past where you have the relevant comparison is not East and West Germany, it would be Germany and Austria. It would be two countries with some common cultural antecedents that end up being permanently two different states. Another analogy would be Latin America in the 19th century or the Middle East in the early 20th century, where once the borders were drawn and local elites became sufficiently entrenched as a national elite, they were unwilling to give up those privileges. If he is unable to manage the situation he is in now, then we face potential regime change. And perhaps the best outcome would be the emergence of a North Korean Park Chung-hee, who would begin a kind of top-down modernization of the country along the lines of the Meiji Restoration or the foundation of modern Turkey under Mustafa Kemal. The issue then would be how to legitimate a non-Kim Il-sungist government in North Korea and how to legitimate the continued division of the peninsula. And I don't think this is a particularly stable outcome. You could have the ironic situation in such a situation that the most radical political forces would be sort of nationalist unifiers who in fact would want to join South Korea. And the ironic thing is you could end up with South Korea keeping that state propped up precisely because they fear the very high economic cost estimates of unification that we discussed today. The third possibility, and this is where I'm not sure if he's still around, but I didn't find Professor Kim's presentation from the previous session completely persuasive, is that we get a breakdown of civil order in North Korea, and you actually do get violence. I mean, yes, of course we prefer peace and stability to violence and disorder, but I'm not sure anybody in this room gets to make that choice. That will emerge not through some interstate violence, but much more likely internal violence within North Korea as the political situation becomes unstable. It could even, you could have political arrest or even civil war. And in that case, you could also potentially have very profound public health issues with a weakened population further disrupted by this internal strife. And you could get, as Peter Beck alluded to in the previous session, both the United States and China drawn in because the militaries are the organizations that have the logistical capacity to respond to mass humanitarian disasters. And so it's really important that the United States, South Korea, and China all be on the same page about what the sort of terms of engagement are in that kind of a chaotic situation. If that is not stable and you do get an abrupt absorption, I think it's much more likely to be violent than in the case of, or accompanied by violence, than in the case of Germany. I really do think the German case is vastly sort of underrated as an outcome. And then and given the prominence of migration as an issue throughout the discussions today, the question immediately arises: can you maintain the DMZ as a method of population influx control, or would that be unsustainable in a democratic South Korea? There are two things here. First of all, whoever the political leader is in South Korea at the time is going to face the same political incentives that Helmut Kohl faced, which is to say he's going to look at North Korea and he's going to see a potential third of the electorate. So his incentive is to treat them gently. Moreover, suppose lots of North Koreans, including women and children, start coming down the road from Kaesong and they reach Dorasan. Are you really going to send out the South Korean army to forcibly hold them back? You're really going to shoot civilians? I mean, once that starts being broadcast on KBS and CNN, then I think this would cause a political crisis within South Korea. So I think the ability to control migration is less than we have been kind of has operated in the background of our discussions. That brings up the issue of democracy and the franchise. In theory, I'm no lawyer, but my understanding of the South Korean Constitution is that in principle the residents of North Korea are also citizens. So if there is abrupt unification, do they immediately get the vote? If so, that raises profound questions about the political culture of a post-unification Korea. These are people who have absolutely no experience with democracy. They've gone from the Yi dynasty to Japanese colonialism to, this kind of Stalinist monarchy. And they would be a third of the electorate. And so that raises huge issues of regionalism and potentially anti-democratic forces within a democratic polity. Finally, one thing we really haven't discussed today, but is potentially an issue, is the role of North Koreans who have migrated to the South. I mean, now I guess it's between 20 and 25,000. Those numbers will grow over time. Is there a role for them in this whole process? And if so, what is it? I mean, should we basically be training a counter-elite here in South Korea that can then go north? Or will these people be regarded as carpetbaggers, to use the American parlance, and be rejected if you try to do that? That's just one more of the issues of an immensely complicated potential situation that we have not discussed due to the issues of time, but that gives us the excuse to have another conference.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Professor Funk, please.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank again the organizers for this opportunity and the chance to discuss different views on Korean unification. I would like to make, I will not make any attempt to wrapping up. Okay, this is not what I'm going to do. What I would like to do is I would like to make 1, 2, or 3 comments from a perspective of someone who may be less familiar with the Korean discussion than most people here in the room. I'm an economist. I'm a macro person. I'm a modeling person. And my main task is that, I'm teaching economics, but beyond that, I'm doing a lot of work for central banks. I'm staying in Hong Kong at least 4, 6 weeks a year, working for HKMA, Hong Kong Monetary Authority, mainly helping them modeling. I've done a lot of work for the Bank of Finland. Actually, I've just arrived from Finland. I've done a lot of consulting work for the Bundesbank. And what I would like to do is I would like to make a few comments from this kind of background. Okay. So you may call that as the background of a macro person or a central banker. Okay. If a central banker would have sit here today, and he would have listened to all these kind of discussions, what would he have answered? What would he have said? Or what kind of questions would he have? The first thing is, and this is to some extent driven by the fact that I'm staying in Hong Kong frequently, the focus on Germany may be exaggerated. It may be exaggerated because we are discussing a number of topics which, many speakers have considered to be important, migration, for example, and these kind of issues are also discussed in other countries. There's a lot of work going on these kind of issues. For example, when you think about China, China nowadays is discussing the hukou system and the role of the hukou system. There are a lot of really good modeling work, not inside China but outside China, both in the US and in Europe, about how this system actually works and what a preferred system would look like. This is also answering part of your questions. So can we restrict migration? To what extent? What is welfare maximizing? So what I'm considering is there's a lot of interesting work going on, not in Germany, had never been implemented in Germany, which may be highly relevant for the Korean case. And I would suggest to have a look at that. My second point is, when I came here, I became aware of that there are a number of institutions here. You can see them on top, okay? Korean institutions plus DC, who are working on Korean unification, who have some responsibility. I'm not familiar with the details, but to some extent they're engaged in these kind of debates. And a central banker would always argue that when you're facing something you have to do and you're communicating with the public, then you need a clear communication strategy. Okay, this is essential for monetary policy. And there's a huge economic debate about how central banks should communicate with the public. Most central banks nowadays are strictly following these kind of advice. And the key thing here is that you have to provide a clear lesson. A clear lesson in the sense that you have to have a story. Maybe different institutions have different stories, but you have to provide a clear story. In terms of modeling, coming back to my favorite thing, what I would like to see is that different institutions, whether it's KDI or whatever, come up with some suggestions about how they consider a scenario to look like. Okay, you're building a model, you're solving the model, and you cannot, communicate the equations, but as central banks do, they're also not communicating the equations, but they're coming up with the outcome of the model, and they're communicating the outcome model, including the uncertainty which is involved. Okay. When you think about the uncertainty, it's very important that you're communicating uncertainties. The Bank of England at the end of the when it was 1997 or 1998, I don't remember exactly, when they've introduced this kind of fan chart technology and whatever, so they have not only communicated some kind of mean outcome, they've also communicated some uncertainty, and because you cannot really communicate a confidence band because no one in the public understands what a confidence band is, they've introduced these kind of fancy graphs which they call fan charts. I don't know whether that's the optimal solution, but central banks are seriously considering about how they have to communicate both some kind of mean projection plus the uncertainty surrounding the mean outcome. This is very essential. So you have to have these kind of institutions there. They have to compete in terms of modeling. They have to compete in terms of technologies they're providing, communicating in an effective way. By the way, there are a lot of modeling strategies around which are explicitly dealing with uncertainty. For example, there's a huge literature in economics, what we call robust modeling. Robust modeling means how can we derive policy rules which are robust, for example, with respect to model misspecification. There's a lot of expertise in central banking which I see which seems to be not to be applied to these kind of topics here. I think there's a lot of room, long way to go. And my guess is that since everything depends upon how the public is informed and whether the public is following some kind of advice, policies have to be forward-looking. This is a really crucial issue. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Dr. John, you have a maximum 7 minutes or 5 minutes. Okay.
First of all, I also would like to thank Chairman Sagong-il for organizing such a wonderful conference and bringing distinguished participants from abroad. I really have learned a lot from this conference. We have discussed a wide range of topics, benefits and cost and unification and lessons from German experience, so on. Instead of summarizing general the aspects of what we have discussed so far, I just want to make two brief summaries that I think is most important. First, I think that migration is the key determinant, not only in the unification process, but also in design policies, transition policies, and economic unification policies. We have seen examples of such a case from the speakers, and there is not much room for us to do differently in terms of policies than the German case if Korean unification, or if migration is the driving force in the case of Korean unification too. We can do differently maybe in terms of wage policies and privatization policies, but I think most of the economic policy response, I guess, will be limited by the presence of migration. And my final comment is that therefore we also need to prepare for a unification scenario in which migration is not the major driving force. In that case, we may try very different policies than Germany chose. That's my observation.
Thank you very much. Our Vice Minister of Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade joined us now. This Mr. An Ho-young, Ambassador An Ho-young is sitting there. We welcome you, and please, yes, say hello to everyone. I wish the 3 presidential candidates were here. In fact, when I first gave thought to this conference, I thought the importance of the role of international community was because I remember the President Mitterrand half-jokingly once said that he liked Germany so much that he needs 2 Germanys. I think it really has some, and read the Prime Minister Thatcher's autobiography and any other records, you do know that there were the general, not I would say general atmosphere, but the major concerns shared by European leaders. But Chancellor Kohl, in my view, did such a good job in persuading these leaders. Of course, Willy Brandt and others already did some groundwork, but Chancellor Kohl deserves a lot of credit for persuading this. In fact, the currency euro was introduced. I suppose there are many other reasons, other factors, but one of the factors was often said that the Chancellor Kohl tried to persuade the President Mitterrand to accept this German unification. In return, he promised that he would introduce the euro, giving up the Deutsche Mark. So what I had in mind is the role of international community. And say we have immediate neighbors: China, Japan, Russia, and the United States. How we convince them that unified Korea will be better for the Korean peninsulas, not only Korean peninsula, the global stability and peace. And I think this is a very important task. And this our next president's role, in my view, since this opportunity is coming, maybe under different scenarios, but we should get ready for it, and the politicians have do their own job and be aware of what has happened. So that actually that was the main purpose of putting the role of international community in fact. And then also the importance of multilateral institutions, including World Bank and Asian Development Bank, and we should work very closely with them because the impact of the Korean unification, particularly under German type of scenario, be so huge. It's just not just regional, but be really almost global, and that's why we have to work very closely with the international community. Well, having said this, if I don't think I will ever attempt to summarize what's been discussed all day, and there's so much things discussed, but I can think of about 5 the subject areas Korea should pay close attention in reference to German experience. First, migration. All the speakers talked about income differences and wage differences. But I would add there that someone implied there that, but the level of North Korean the income is very important, which is under the subsistence level, absolute poverty level. And at the time of German unification, East Germans already enjoy this fairly high, relatively high living standards. And that has much implication on the potential migration. But when people starve to death, and if you have an option, what would you do? So this migration issue for Korea, in my view, is much more serious than what Germans experienced. So what are you going to do? Someone talked about keeping TMZ. Of course, that is, I think, is one option. And so this migration issue, I think we have to concentrate on this and what we want to do about it specifically, because the event might drive us to make have to make a choice on this. And then the monetary union issue again. Of course, we can draw so many valuable lessons from the German experience here. But again, whether you want to keep one state or two system, or some other the options. So I think this is again for Koreans to really get prepared for it. And then the third, the issue which I think is very, very critical, and the Deputy Minister Carstens, I think, mentioned it, as is property right and the land ownership. Unless you make it clear that investment will not occur as much as you expect. And so we can again draw much lessons from Germany in this regard. I think here again, what are you going to do? I think there are some, the early North Korean refugees, they fled maybe during the Korean War or immediately after the Korean War. They may still have the property ownership. Land ownership, they may have some document. What are you going to do about it, and so forth. So there are things to be really give detailed thought about on is this. And another thing is state-owned enterprises, and whether you're going to have, because if you have the one soap factory in North Korea and we have soap factories here, I don't think you can compare the efficiency of these companies. So you're going to have immediate closure there, as West Germany did. I don't think that is the option, and that will cause all this migration issue even worsen. And so these kind of specific things we have to be concerned. And then another thing is welfare system. Again, what kind of social safety net. Again, this has to do related with the migration issue again. And so these are some of the critical issue areas. I think we have to really give some detailed thought to it. And ideally, the gradual unification may be most desirable, but event may not allow us to have that kind of a situation. So we have to have a contingency plan, and we should get well prepared for it. So in that regard, I think these very critical issue areas we have to be concerned with, and then the political leaders should really find ways to work with the neighboring countries and the international community. So I know the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Deputy Minister shares this views with me, but I hope city candidates pay attention to this. I'll make guarantee you that we'll publish proceedings as quick as possible, and we'll make sure to send the proceedings to our candidates. Well, with this, I think we have to end a very, very the productive and fruitful meeting today, and maybe we will, with this, we will have the seminars on specific issue areas later on. Well, with this, thank you very much for your patience and your attendance to the last minute. And please give big hands to all these speakers and participants.